bells of the city had not been rung for dawn since the old king died. But the sound of the hour markers seemed different the morning. The frost reached King's Landing. The notes went up from a tower blackened long ago by smoke and war, and the air caught them and made them thin. The streets were not ready for a cold that came in like a thought, sudden and absolute. Windows that had never felt winter's bite sweated into glassy tears. The cobbles, usually slick with slop and spilt ale, went hard and clean under a clear sky as pale as the belly of a fish. Down in Flea Bottom, a butcher tested the edge of his knife and watched his breath bloom into small clouds that disappeared as soon as they were born. Along the city walls, the sentries stamped their boots and peered out over a blackwater bay that looked dull and pewter, its ripples slow and stiff, as if unwilling to move. In the Red Keep, the cold meant nothing, and meant everything. The stoves roared, fire embroidered shadows on the walls of the Queen's solar. Heat folded itself into the velvet on the chairs and the wool in the rugs and the fine threads of the draperies. Yet Cersei Lannister could feel winter like a fingernail drawn lightly along her skin as she stood near the window with a cup of spiced wine. She did not drink. The glass panes were clear enough to catch her reflection, hair the color of pale coin, face carved in familiar lines, eyes like fine-cut smoke. The city behind her was waking. Smoke rose from 1,000 hearths and a dozen ash-pitted braziers, and the river minted the morning with a scent of salt and metal. She watched it all with the stillness that came to her when she had outpaced rage and calculation both. A stillness that had once held when wildfire turned the world green and screaming. A knock, soft, as if the wood itself were reluctant. She did not turn. Enter. Qyburn moved as he always did, as if he did not quite disturb the air. He smelled faintly of old paper and black pepper, and when he stopped, he kept his hands folded in the sleeves of his robe. The torchlight read his face as curious rather than kind. A raven, your grace. From whom? From Dragonstone. Her fingers tightened on the stem of the cup, and even that small motion irritated her. She set the wine aside and held out her hand for the parchment. The wax was broken already. Qyburn's neatness never betrayed urgency, except by its existence where none was asked. She read. The letters were strong, written by someone who had learned on a rough surface and then taught herself to make the roughness a strength. She could hear Tyrion in the cadence, even if he had not set the quill. She could hear the Dragon Queen beneath him, and beyond them both the unlovely shape of a man who had bent the knee and thought himself noble for it. Cersei read the words twice, and then folded the paper so that the break in the wax aligned with the crease. The Dragon Pit. A parley. Proof. But her child turned within her, or she imagined it. She pressed a hand, wide-fingered and delicate, against the front of her dress above the white-stitched lion and the line of boning that made her feel held together. She remembered the taste of fear once upon a time and refused to have it now. She had died and returned more times than any priest would allow. She had left sons behind her like pearls broken from a necklace. Her father's voice spoke in daylight and in dreams. She would not be called to account in a ring of ancient stone by a woman who had burned slavers in city-states and who thought that made her better than a queen. But she could not ignore the letter. To ignore the summons was to let the story write itself without her. Send for the hand, she said. Qyburn did not say, we do not have one. He inclined his head and went without the faintest trace of irony, closing his mouth. It comforted Cersei more than she would admit that the castle possessed at least one man who could read the shape of her mind and never make the mistake of naming the parts aloud. She walked the length of the solar, the soft nap of the rug giving under her slippered feet. The fire spit and settled. Sun reached at last to the corner of the window and made dust into specks of gold. When she blinked, they vanished. The woman in the glass returned her gaze, level and entirely unafraid. There was a time for treachery and a time for theater. And today would be theater, upon which all future treachery must be staged. When Jaime came, he came in armor polished enough to catch the room and put it beside him in miniature. A lion's head, the wolf's half-remembered snout scratched along the edge of his mind, the glimmer of the cups on the sideboard. He paused in the doorway and then crossed to her with the deliberate rolling gait that armor requires, one hand resting always on the empty space, where a sword would have been more natural. The blessed white bandage of fresh scars had gone, and the stump below the golden hand behaved as it ought. That had become the shape of him in her mind. The man who had lost a right and learned to be left. "Your Grace," he said. "Brother." His eyes went at once to her face, and then to the table where Qyburn had neatly set the letter for him. Jaime read it over once, then again, lips moving very slightly, as if the words had weight that needed to be shifted into place. "They want a meeting at the Dragon Pit," he said at last, "to show us what they've seen. They want to flatter themselves with the importance of their message." Cersei replied, "Dragons won't be enough. Now they require ghosts to carry their cause to the gates." "You have seen the dead," Jaime said more quietly. "Haven't you?" Cersei's attention moved to the window and stayed there, as if something in the air were a small figure running on a roofline she must track. "I have seen them weeping in the streets, and wearing crowns, and standing in a chapel that no longer exists," she said. "I have seen enough of death, Jaime. But if they have a trick to show us in the Dragon Pit, we will watch it. Bring the mountain. Die. Bring Qyburn. Bring that cursed priest who lit the pyres at the shore. If he's still in the city and has not run off in pursuit of a brighter flame. Mendaiwand." "We agreed to the thing once before," Jaime said. "The truce with the North. The letters. We agreed to nothing," Cersei said. "We allowed Tyrion to believe he had outpaced my suspicion. He did not." She turned then, and noticed the line at the corner of Jaime's mouth that memory made tender. "And yet," she added more softly, "perhaps the world has changed from under us once again. We will see." She dressed for the Dragon Pit as a queen going to hear prayers might dress. The gown was black, the black of deep wells and dry ink and velvet pressed down by the weight of years. The shoulders were armored with scales of silver, sewn one by one. The collar rose like a closed hand around her throat. The circlet in her hair shone. She felt the child's presence again, as pressure rather than movement. A single pulse that could have been her heart or its own. She let herself stand quietly for a count of 10 after the maidservants had gone. Just to hear the sound of her breathing, and to watch her pose change the woman in the window from queen to statue and back again. They went out by the king's gate, because spectacle has a more precise value when measured only by those invited to see. The mountain rode beside the litter on a horse that did not much like him. The animal's ears slid back, then forward, as if it could not agree with itself, and therefore would accept misery as a compromise. Qyburn rode immediately behind, hands on pommel, dozing posture deceptive as always. Jaime rode to the left, and when the litter hit a rut, he turned his head because the reflex to look at her when anything shifted had more life in him than old vows. The sun was high by then, and it made the old stones honest. Where the sept had been there was a scar, the cobbles shying away from it, not yet covered over with the new market stalls selling bells and scrap metal and green-painted candles that would forever smell of lard. People watched them pass and tried to decide how deep they should bend. The Dragon Pit had held dragons once. It had held the idea of dragons long after their bodies had gone to dust. The city had never liked it, and had liked the people who had loved it even less. Its arches were still fine, its stone as white as bone in places, and inside it the old steel had softened into a gray like the color of storm water. The sand felt dry underfoot. The heat in the center of the ruined dome was not summer heat. It was the heat of a body long after exertion. Wrong in this season, but welcome all the same. A small knot of Unsullied stood motionless, spears upright, as if they had been carved in place. Grey Worm was with them. The long braids, the high cheekbones, the eyes that took everything in. He did not flinch at Sir Gregor. He did not look away. Cersei saw the other queen a moment later, and looking at her was like looking at a conflagration through glass. Daenerys Targaryen moved as though every motion cost exactly what it ought, and paid the debt. Silver blonde hair and 3 ropes down her back, a cloak like the back of a cormorant, boots made for use, not show. One dragon wheeled high overhead, and dropped its shadow across the ring of stone and sand. A long black shape that slid up Cersei's legs, and pulled at her hem. No fear, she told herself, and stood without moving, making her stillness the shape of authority. To one side stood Tyrion. Small and complicated, his mouth already arranging itself around a dozen possible phrases. Varys had stationed himself near a pillar. The pillar was probably the safer of the two to lean against. Jon Snow, the man who had bent and thought the angle noble, stood a little forward of Daenerys, as if he could be misunderstood for her bodyguard, and would allow it. He had the same air of someone who had just left the wilderness, and found it less wild than courts. He was handsome in the way of a knife, the lines of him clean and inevitable. Brienne was there too, the tall woman who had once been an oath and had learned to be person. Jaime saw her at once, and looked away at once more slowly, which was its own form of looking. The hound had a crate and a disgusted expression positioned with care to suggest that the two had been delivered together and could not be separated without damage. No one knelt. That was its own theater. "We will have our demonstration," Cersei said, her voice not raised, but shaped to cross the space, to curl around pillars and be heard. "You requested the honor of our fear. Well, give us a reason to grant it." The hound hauled the crate forward and undid the latches with the surly competence of a man who had no patience left for anyone's awe. He kicked the side once and then pulled it away. The thing that came out at him did so with the mindless velocity of a thrown spear. It had been a man, and now was a body with teeth. The smell that rolled out was sweet and wrong. Cersei did not move. She watched the blade come down, watched the thing stagger, watched the ropes securing it go taut. The sound it made when it tried to bite something that wasn't there was a rattle like beads in a child's toy, and something more like wind in a chimney. Qyburn had leaned forward, eyes bright, his mouth slightly open as if he had been given a puzzle he had very much wanted to be given. The mountain did not alter his posture at all. Daenerys' face did not change. Jon Snow's did. The change was small and honest. The hound did the business that was required. The severing, the demonstration of a hand still moving, while the arm from which it had been cut lay quiet. The fire and the obsidian and the abrupt ending of motion, when either met rotten flesh. Cersei let the tableau make its argument. When Qyburn bent, very quickly, and took up the still hand and turned it twice, that was within expectation and therefore permitted. When he put it down again, faster than he had picked it up, that was a new thing and therefore recorded. "The dead walk," Tyrion said, "and walk towards us." Cersei watched him as she might watch a juggler she had seen before. "The trick is better than the telling." She said, "And the trick is good." "There's no trick," Jon Snow said. His voice had the north in it the way fire has light. "I have fought them. I have killed them and watched them get up again. I've watched friends rise. It's not a game you can win by refusing to play." Nam Chen. "Then we are agreed that the game must be different," Cersei said. She looked at Daenerys because it was Daenerys she needed, not the man who imagined himself between summers. "If we do this, we do it with terms." Jon Snow took a breath as if to answer, but Daenerys lifted one hand very slightly, and the words died at the edge of his teeth. "We will hear your terms," she said. "You want my armies," Cersei said. "You want the city's grain, and the forges, and the roads, and the obedience that makes obedience possible. You want me not to burn you when you come into my lands with your dragons. In return, I want an end to this when it is ended. Not your hand closed around my throat. Not a war that goes hot, the instant the cold has finished with us. You want us to stand beside you to fight something that would end us all. Good. We will stand. But when it is over, we will talk as if we are people, not goddesses and ghosts. We will have a council of the living. The lords will come. If they want you on a throne afterwards, they may put you there. If they want me, they may try to keep me. If they want someone else, they can be fools together. But I will not hand the realm to you as a dowry for a war that I did not start." "Eh?" Tyrion's mouth half opened, then closed again. He looked at Daenerys, and his eyes spoke volumes of advice without speaking at all. Daenerys' gaze did not leave Cersei's. "And while we fight," she said, There will be no war between us. None. Cersei said. She made the word a flat stone thrown just hard enough to skip and land. Hostages, Qyburn said blandly, a voice from behind Cersei's shoulder. A guarantee of good faith. It is an old method because it is a reliable one. Jon Snow turned his head toward the old man the way a hound hears something and redistributes its attention. The suggestion pleased the city, which lived on the steady diet of such transactional thinking. It displeased the parts of the north that had not forgotten the taste of a father's head upon a spike. Cersei, who felt the tilt in the air like a shift in a dancer's weight, smiled, though she did not change her mouth to do it. No hostages, she said. Not yet. She let the word yet hang like a curtain behind which a room might or might not exist. I want something less clumsy and more binding. I want your word, Lord Snow. I want the word of the man who was a king until he decided he was not. I want to know that you will not put my crowns in your woman's lap the moment a corpse with blue eyes has fallen and decided to stay down. I have already, Jon began. Daenerys spoke before he could finish. I will give mine, she said. No attack on your lands. No claim forced upon you until the dead are ended. No dragon's fire on your people. And when the dead are ended, we talk with the lords, as you say. Madame. Cersei lifted her chin, but not in triumph. Then we have a truce. And an alliance as long as the dead walk. She felt the child as a thought again. Hovering at the edge of decision. We will send grain north. We will send men. We will send iron. And we will send fire, Daenerys said. She had not smiled. Not once. The dragon above turned in the gray circle of the sky, as if it had been listening and had just agreed to have an appetite. The thing in the sand burned at last into true death. The smell of it went away very quickly. The echo of its existence did not. After the others had moved to talk near the pillars and under the broken ribs of the dome, after Tyrion had spoken in a voice meant for two, and Jaime had held himself like a man learning to breathe through a new injury, Cersei stood alone with the remains of a creature that she could not rule, and therefore could only outlast. The sand was disturbed in circles around the char. The char itself was clean in the manner of things that have been thoroughly destroyed. She wanted to laugh. Instead, she walked to the edge of the pit and stood where the shadow of the dragon had laid itself along her feet, and thought of the child's bones knitting in the dark with every hour she bought. On Dragonstone, fires were kept for warmth as well as counsel. But the wind that came off the sea had a clean salt taste that did something orderly to the mind. The castle had been built to hear the waves. Daenerys stood on the edge of the courtyard and let the sound come up out of the rocks and into her chest until she could believe that breathing and the rhythm of that old water had agreed to keep time with one another. Drogon slept with one eye closed and one eye a molten sliver. He breathed steam on the flagstones, and where the air blew it away, it came back at once. Rhaegal had taken the high fin of stone that jutted like a spine and settled into it as if he had grown there. The sky was hard and clear. Smoke from the kitchens wrote neat lines that unraveled as the wind asked them to. The smell of fish stew and hot bread did not make a dent in the day. Missandei stood with her, a quiet presence who could be counted upon to make silence spacious rather than small. Tyrion came to them like a man who has rehearsed his entrance and will now improvise his lines. Varys had drifted the way fog drifts and settled on the far side of the fire to warm his hands, as if hands were a thing he could ever truly warm. You granted her terms, Tyrion said, not without surprise. I granted the living terms, Daenerys said. And I granted the dead nothing. Tyrion's smile was a private thing that brought all the lines on his face into complicity. You will make a queen of yourself yet. I am one, she said without heat. I do not need to be made. I need to be kept. They spoke then of ships and roads, of the stored grain in the riverlands, of the way ice changes wood, and how many wagons it takes to move 1,000 spear points in a week. The mathematics of survival has a smell like charcoal. Grey Worm came to them and gave a soldier's report of a soldier's order. Their ranks would refit for winter marching. Men would drill with the new obsidian blades as if memory could be remade into muscle by repetition. Jorah stood a little apart, as if closeness itself were a hazard. And when Daenerys looked at him, his eyes grew clear and soft, as if the sight of her had told him a story he had known and only half remembered. Between them all, Jon Snow moved like someone who knew how to be the bridge between two banks that would have preferred never to see one another. He did not speak very often, and when he did, it was to notice the mildness of the day, and the fact of it being mild, that he could smell rain, not snow, on the air, that the sound of the gulls had a different pitch than they did in Deepfjord, where he had once waited with a boat that would not come. When he was silent, Daenerys heard him anyway, a weight beside hers on the stone. "Cersei, I will send grain," Varys said, a little skepticism cleverly hidden in admiration's close. "And men, and iron. She will send what it profits her to send," Daenerys said. "Which will be enough, because we will make it enough." "She asked for a council when it's done," Tyrion said. "A gathering of lords to decide who rules. It was not what I would have proposed for you, but it was clever. It looks like mercy from across the room. It will be done when it is done," Daenerys said. "I care about the living first." "You always have," Missandei said. Daenerys thought of the slave cities, of the way ropes had been cut and bells rung, and men had fallen with their chains loud around them. She thought of the pit fights, and she thought of the children who had pressed their hot hands to her skirts and called her mother, and then run away, laughing, unafraid. She thought of fire making an arch over her, and finding no purchase, and choosing the sky instead. She thought of Cersei standing like a blade in a sheath made of her own restraint, and she thought of the way the woman's eyes had held theirs. "She loves her child," Daenerys said aloud without meaning to. "That binds." Tyrion looked at her sharply. "You saw it." "I saw the memory of it around her, like a scent. She loves with the kind of love that has killed kingdoms. I will take it and use it. She will do the same to me." Memsauer. They sent the first ships within a day. The low, wide-bellied cogs, with their simple triangulated sails, suited the winter water better than the sharp, swift curves of the longships. But the Ironborn could not be kept from proving that their ships were better than any that had ever sailed. Euron Greyjoy's fleet was a reek on the water and an insult on the air. His banners were the color of old bruises, and his laughter spread out behind him like oil. He had come to the dragon pit and smirked, made a show of boredom, made an exit like a dagger thrown to make a point. Now he sat on his black ship and stood with his legs wide and his hands on his hips, and shouted something about the cold that no one on the King's Quay could quite hear, and everyone could all the same. Cersei watched him from the end of the pier, a fur-lined cloak heavy as a promise across her shoulders. The Queen's Guard arrayed themselves like pieces in a game played for a god's amusement. The first wagons creaked under the weight of grain. The men in charge of them yelled at their teams with the kind of profanity that made the air sparkle. Qyburn hovered near her shoulder, as if he had never been anywhere else, and never would be. "The dragon glass blades splinter," he said. "Mild and academic, but in splintering they make more edge. One must choose the right balance of pitch to hold them to a shaft. Iron nails split the stone, so we use boiled rawhide and resin. As the resin cools, it shrinks and holds. Useful." Cersei did not bother to indulge his delight. "And the fire?" "Fireworks," Qyburn said. "Green or red. The dead have a relationship to heat that we do not. It alters them, however." He sounded almost disappointed. "It makes smoke, and smoke spends itself quickly in wind and cannot be counted upon to suffocate. We will not suffocate them," Cersei said, almost laughing. "We will break them one by one, until the breaking is complete." "Your Grace," he said, a smile like a needle. At the far end of the pier, a group of small folk pressed forward cautiously, eyes large, mouths smaller. A child had climbed onto a barrel and pointed with both hands at the dragon on the wing, as if pointing were the only way to contain what she saw. The mother's hand on the back of the child's neck was gentle but firm. The child's fingers curled into themselves and uncurled again. Cersei watched the child's joy and thought of Tommen leaning a little too far from a window once, too eager for a better view, and felt the world wobble in the gut before it righted itself. She turned away because turning away is a form of triumph when you do it without hurry. In the street of steel, the forges bloomed like winter roses, and smiths who had never loved the thought of winter sang to themselves to keep the rhythm of hammer and quench and grind. The dragon glass came in hemmed in straw, wrapped with care in old cloth, saved from the more patient kinds of poverty. It was a rock that remembered fire and did not forget it even in the dark. The black of it was not the black of coal, but the black of a mirror, and when it shivered under a well-placed blow, it made the air sharp around it. A boy named Tom, there are always boys named Tom, held a new-made spear and turned it in the light and watched the way the edge took a breath of sunlight and let it go. He rewrapped it with a grave tenderness the new learn without being taught. His older sister, a woman of 30 with 4 arms like rope and a mouth for smiling, told him that if he dropped it, she would wrap his fingers around the forge poker instead and see how he liked that. The thread had an old, joking shape. It made the other apprentices show their teeth in a line. The first winter wind that swept down the black water and into the city reached at the same moment for the riverlands and the neck. It found in those damp places a world already prepared to be claimed. The marsh grasses lay down under a skin of ice like a creature playing dead. Ravens lifted suddenly out of trees and went like thrown stones into the gray. As the green bled out of the low hills, men pulled their collars up around their ears and talked about a cold they had known as boys, and how this was different because it was the same, and somehow worse. The northern road was a thing with ruts and memories, and the groans of old animals on it. Now it felt the weight of Lannister red alongside northern gray, and the neat, burnished precision of unsullied steel, and the ragged, wild sweep of Dothraki hair like banners under helmets that were no helmets at all. In some villages, women came out to watch, as if they were at a harvest dance. In some, doors closed and shutters latched, because the sound of hooves and wheels together is always too much for those who remember other sounds like it. The men in Lannister crimson grew used to the unsmiling eyes of men who wore no uniform at all, and whose attention said kill and call it prudence. The men from the Crownlands learned to sleep lighter. In the evenings, frost would bloom like white flowers along the straps of saddles and the edges of tents, and men who had never been alone with their thoughts for this long learned new names for loneliness that had been in their mouths all their lives without translation. Jaime rode at the head of one column and looked at the world with a depth of focus he had not used since he was a boy. The trees were thinner than he remembered them in the riverlands, the fields more exhausted, the rivers more intent. The weight of his armor had become what it always did on the third day of marching, a second body. Bronn rode beside him with the glowing irritability of a man who believed in money more than prayer, and had recently been asked to consider the latter. Bronn spoke of whores and their cleverness, of ale and its failures, of wet socks and their malice. The words moved like fish in a stream around Jaime's thoughts. Across the column, Brienne rode with the loyalty of a constancy that had learned to stand mild and square in weather. The color in her cheeks was the kind winter gives to those it approves of, a clean red that did not belong to shame. She did not look at Jaime because the looking had been done, and what was left was not looking anymore but the harder, heavier work of not forgetting. At night, by the cook fires, men told the old stories about the long night, as if by reciting them they could make those older roads appear beneath their feet and walk them instead of this one. They said there had been a hero who had put the red heart of his love on a sword and called it light, and that the sword had burned away the cold, and that the cold had retreated out of respect for the size of the gesture. They spoke of pale spiders as big as hounds and hungry as debt. They spoke of a woman in a tower who had survived on ivy and prayer. The younger men listened with expressions that flickered between disgust and belief. A Lannister pikeman named Sewell, who had been born in a village where a river did its best to forget it was a river, learned to play at dice with a man from White Harbor and a Dothraki boy whose laughter had the hard edges of foreign coin. The dice felt warm in his hands. He liked that. He liked the way the Dothraki boy watched his fingers with open admiration, as if any kind of skill belonged to anyone who owned it and would endure. He liked the taste of the stew when it burned his tongue. He wrote a letter to a sister he had not seen in 6 years, and told her about the dragon he had watched come down low over the road. The wind of it, a physical thing that pushed against his chest and made him put a hand out without thinking to brace himself. He did not tell her that he had cried a little, because he was not the kind of man who knew to leave that bit out or put it in. He simply wrote about the color of the scales in the sun, green and black, and how the beast had looked at him as if counting the men on the road to save itself the trouble later. In King's Landing, the cold found the stones and made of them an instrument. The city discovered that its noise was different when air had been removed from the space between things. The clatter of pots, the shout of women for their children, the calls of sellers, the slap of sandals and boots, all came cleaner and thinner, as if taken up an octave and played by a smaller hand. The city's work went on. The pits outside the Gate of the Gods burned with refuse to keep the night air from biting every ear at once. The lamps along the more fashionable streets were lit earlier and extinguished later. In the Red Keep, the bedchambers and solar were kept warm enough to make the skin on the hands sting slightly when anyone passed through a drafty hallway. Cersei asked the household to use half the candles they would have used in a summer month, and then did not notice whether they obeyed her, because the pleasure was not in the saving, but in the speaking. She walked sometimes at dusk through the gardens that had been coaxed into accepting the notion of winter. The laurels behaved themselves. The fountains wore shawls. The goldfish in the small formal pond near the kitchen had been scooped out with nets and put into a barrel in the cellar where they ate and ate without knowing they were to be eaten. Cersei listened to the water speak into the stone basins and thought about armies moving far away and ships shaping the weather with their wakes. She met with Qyburn more than with any other living soul. They sat in a room that had once held a collection of little painted statues of kings and queens from across the western continent, though no one could say why or whether they were accurate. The statues had been removed because they collected dust in complex ways that made the servants resentful. Now the table held only small, neat squares of obsidian, and a set of glass lenses Qyburn claimed had been made in Lys by a man who had ground them while staring at the sea. When the old man put the glass in front of one eye and made of himself a ridiculous owl, he did not look ridiculous at all. He looked like what he was, a merchant of certainties. The bones of them are wrong, he said. They are there, but they are wrong. The joints move, but the tendons are not as ours are. There is strength in the wrong places. They do not complain. That is one difference that should not be a difference, and is. They remember what they need to remember, and forget what they can afford to forget. They do not understand pain, and so are not persuaded by it, which is inconvenient. They are persuaded by disassembly, which is tedious. Fire persuades them. Dragonglass makes them halt and consider the notion of stopping, and while they consider, they fall apart. Valyrian steel has a conversation with them. They do not survive. I have not discovered why. Then? You will, Cersei said. Yes, Qyburn said peacefully. I will, or I will not. Either way will be interesting. Her hand went almost absently to her belly. She did not say anything. Qyburn noticed the motion and did not say anything. That is what it is to be loved by the servants of your ambition. They will notice and not speak, which is a form of respect more valuable than sincerity. On the terrace below the queen's rooms, the dragon came down one afternoon and lit on the red stone with a sound like a sail unfurling. Rhaegal, the green one, the one who did not respond to a name the way a dog does, but was nevertheless a creature shaped by names. Cersei was alone and stepped closer without calling for a guard, because some moments are cowardice only if there is more than one witness. The dragon lowered his head and turned the great gold of his eye. It had a slit for a pupil, yes, but the iris was an entire world of colors, green and gold and amber, like a forest roof with sunlight filtering through. He looked at her. She looked at him. The heat coming off him was astonishing. Without moving, she felt the end of her nose warm and the hair on her arms stir. He made a small sound in his chest that reminded her of the low cough of a big cat. Qyburn would have said something about similarity of sounds and forms and the taxonomies of nightmares. Cersei did not. She kept still. He breathed out very carefully, as if he had learned the idea of care from someone and was trying it on. And the edge of her cloak fluttered. Then he lifted again, up into the air as easily as thought lifts when a new thought takes its hand and says, "Come on." She watched him go until he was silhouette, and then until he was memory. When at last word came, ravens, always ravens, that the dead had reached the last river, that they had taken the bridge and torn it down and then crossed anyway when the water froze solid below them in a night and a half, the world tilted. Plans acquired weight they had lacked before. The roots for grain became roots for men. The men became lines on a map. The lines became questions that stuck to one's teeth. Daenerys moved north with her armies like a weather system. Jon rode out and back, to speak to men he had once spoken to, and who would listen again, and to men he had never known, whose skepticism had been shaped like rocks in a field. Each needed to be moved carefully to be useful. The North accepted the truce like a bitter drink, face steady, throat working. Sansa received the news in Winterfell with a composure that had been burned into her on days when being composed had seemed a cruel joke. She walked the walls and felt the old wood settle under her boots. She watched the smiths at the forges Tyrion had designed prove his point with sparks and sweat, and then go home to their wives and daughters and mothers, with hands that smelled of metal and smoke. She wrote letters that said, "You will do this," and then with more cleverness than the command itself, made the doing seem inevitable, even chosen. When she touched the white bark in the god's wood, her skin did not change temperature, but something in her heart did, as if the tree carried frost in its farthest end, and had decided to share. Arya moved through the keep like a knife moves through a fold of fabric, not tearing, not leaving a hole, and nevertheless making a garment into more than it had been. She said little. When Sansa spoke to her, she tilted her head like a bird and listened and answered. And sometimes she laughed, and in the laughter was the child who had once chased cats and had muddy knees and wore joy as if it were made for her. At night she touched the faces she carried and looked at them as one might look at gambling pieces, not with the love of ownership, but with the care one gives to tools. She did not say aloud that she wanted to be where the Dragon Queen would stand beside the Lion Queen, not for the spectacle but for the simplicity of the line so drawn. She did not say that she would be satisfied with the thought of it for now. She said nothing, and when she smiled, the smile frightened the people who loved her more than it comforted them. On the road near Moat Cailin, where the causeway lifts up above a world made of water and shadow, and the kind of green that stays green even under snow, a small skirmish revealed itself like a stain in cloth. Scouts came back missing one of their number. A horse returned with its saddle torn, and its eyes thus strangely calm, as if terror had burned through and left tranquility behind it, the way fever leaves sweat. Jon went forward with a handful of men he had measured and come to trust on the basis of their silences. Daenerys walked with them because walking is a statement, and because distance could be measured more precisely in shared breath than in miles. Grey Worm made of himself a hinge for the rest of the movement, and the Dothraki moved in patterns that had been carved into their blood by plains far away. Jaime went because he had understood at last that when your enemy says, "Stand here," the better answer is to stand slightly to the left and force them to adjust, not to refuse to stand at all. Brienne walked near him without intention, and the air between them behaved like a thing remembering something it had been trained to do. The dead sent out their cleverness. It is a myth that only the living hope and plan. A shape moved among the reeds where no shape should have, and another shape did not move where something smaller would have run. The first white they saw had been a woman once. Her hair was a crown of frost, her mouth the wrong kind of dark. When she turned her head, the motion reiterated itself like a remembered gesture. The neck went a fraction too far, came back a fraction too cleanly. Jon's sword, Valyrian, black, the edges like premonitions, went through the air with the casual precision of a man who has learned to call the dance by its proper name. The white came apart. The sound it made doing so did not have a word. The second white had been a boy, and he moved faster, and with the fervor of what had been youth, and was now speed given nightmare. Grey Worm's spear found it in the gut, and then found it again higher, at an angle. and then found the skull on the return. 3 more. Fire tuned down. The smell. The sound of ice. Cersei stood on her terrace later and received the report from a rider who had changed horses 3 times between the neck and the city, and whose face had been bleached by wind. She gave him wine. She told him to sit. He could not stop standing. His knees did not trust the concept any longer. He got through the story with the same look a man gets when he is pulling a splinter and cannot see his own hands. "Thank you," she said. And when he had gone, she said nothing for a time. The river made its noise. Somewhere below her, a woman laughed at a joke and then coughed as if the joke had been smoke. When Daenerys returned to her tent after that first brush with the thing that was coming, not a battle, not even a song about a battle, but a fingernail scratching at the door, she sat with her back to a carefully mended canvas wall and let her bones tell her about their opinions. She could feel the new work in them. The riding, the walking, the readiness. Drogon slept near enough to make the ground warm in seams. Jon came because he came. There was no need to send for him. He did not say, "Are you hurt?" because that was not a question worth asking, and not a fear worth feeding. He said, "The marsh smells like mint when it breaks." She looked at him, grateful. "It does." When he left, she slept for an hour that felt like a boat crossing a narrow bay at night. You feel the water under you the whole way, and you trust it anyway by necessity. She dreamed of a woman in black with hair like the inside of a shell and a child in her belly and a world on her tongue. She dreamed of a throne turning to salt, and then to sugar, and then to sand. She woke feeling strong. Tyrion went among the wagons as if they were books in one of the kinder libraries he had known when he was young and undespised by strangers. He touched the sides of them and found where a nail was failing and told a man to hammer it anyway. And the man hammered it and found that it held. He spoke to a tinker who had turned himself into a cartwright for the duration of the emergency, and who would never be a cartwright again if the living survived. The man's face had the weary look of people who have learned to accept a temporary excellence their life was not built to sustain. He told him a joke about mules, and then a story about a king who had mistaken a bargeman for a poet. They laughed, and then went on being alive, which is its own work. When he stopped at the edge of a copse to piss, he found himself staring at his own breath and thought, not without affection, of the wine he had not drunk that morning, and the wine he would find a reason to drink tonight. Jaime sat cleaning his sword because the ritual required it, and the cloth moved in his left hand like a prayer he had memorized with his right and had been forced to translate. Brienne approached and stood, then sat, because standing was ridiculous and sitting only slightly less so. He did not look up. She did not clear her throat. The silence was brisk as a sheet hung out to dry. "Your men," she said at last. "Keep formation well. They are not used to this cold, but they are not talking about it like an injury. They know how to listen." He glanced at her, mouth quirking. "Lannisters are good at listening. It's the hearing that fails us." She made a sound that wanted to be a snort and settled for being humor. "You've improved at that." He looked at the sword and saw in the blade not his reflection but the lack of it. Valyrian steel drank light rather than returning it. "I had a good teacher," he said. And it was not quite a lie. In the far tents, the Dothraki were telling stories in their own language, and the air inside their circle went hot and rich with the sound of it. Grey Worm stood just outside the light, his face bare of any expression at all, and listened because a story is a structure one can stand near and be warmed by, without entering. Nisande, moving among the men who needed words applied to tasks, thought of Deniath where butterflies make a sound when they rise from a chained shrub, and of the way the ocean looks when it reaches for coral, and is sent away, gentle and insistent and gentle again. Night fell early and clean. The stars came like pinpricks in cloth. The cold that came with them was not the soft, tolerant cold of early winter, but another thing entirely. It was a presence. It arranged the air in a new order. It lay upon the hair and into the open mouth. It made itself friend to the parts of the body that complain, and then quieted them by making complaint impossible. The watchfires were carefully fed. The wood popped. Sparks rose and died quickly, as if ashamed of having hoped. Somewhere to the north of them, beyond the bend of the causeway and the folding of ground, the dead continued the work that the living had given up long ago. They moved without regard to comfort or companionship, without the distraction of memory or the interference of hunger. They moved as water moves under ice, when the wind lays a hand on the surface and insists it stay still. There is no metaphor for that motion that does not make of it a lesser thing. It is a fact, and a fact, and a fact. Cersei in her bed dreamed of a room made of green and filled with smoke, and then the smoke became snow, and the snow fell up. She woke with her heart a fist trying to tear itself to pieces, and a taste in her mouth like copper. She did not call for anyone. She lay still and listened to the tiny sounds of a castle at night. The intimate murmur of stone, the gossip of mice, the long breath of the sea. When her breathing had matched the rhythm of those facts, she told herself a story about a throne that could be folded up and put away in a chest for the winter, and taken out again in spring with the moths beaten off it. The story made no sense. It soothed her. She slept. Jon stood alone for a while at the edge of the camp and looked south. The sky there was not different, but he liked the way it pretended to be. There is a peace that does not belong to people, he thought. The way there is a peace that belongs to them, and is therefore not peace at all, but relief. He felt tired to the center of him, and the tiredness was clean. He heard steps and did not turn because he knew who they were. Daenerys stood beside him and did not speak, and he did not speak, and the silence was the shape of a thing that could be placed on a table and inspected at another time. He thought of the gods, and she thought of dragons, and both of them thought of fire, and what it is to stand very near it and not be harmed. In the morning the frost lay in thin sheets halfway up the grass blades, on the ropes, on the iron. Men breathed out and watched the ghosts leave them. A bird hopped on the ground near the edge of the camp, curious and indignant, as if it had been offended by how many people had decided to sleep in its field. Sewell the pikeman woke, with a small sound, and rubbed his hands together and regretted the life he had chosen with a thoroughness that made him smile. He picked up the spear with its new dark head and found that the edge ate the light again the way it had. He walked away from the tent lines to piss. The morning had a smell like iron and apples. When he zipped himself, he saw something move at the far edge of the field. It was a man. It was walking wrong. Sewell did not call out, because to do so would have been to put himself at the center of something he did not want to be the center of. He took 3 steps back, then 4 forward. Indecisive, discovering that the body could put off deciding for longer than the mind would have believed possible. Then the thing lifted its head and showed him a face that had once been a joke told over dice. Sewell made a sound that was at once very small and very pure, like the beginning of a prayer. He raised the spear. Grey Worm's voice came from a place near and far at once, a syllable that was not a word, and nevertheless occupied the place where words had been put to keep chaos from running through. The soldiers he commanded moved into the shows of their training, as if they had been poured into those shapes and settled there. Jaime's column tightened as a hand tightens around a cup when the contents are too hot. Brienne turned her head in a motion that extended beyond her, and the men around her mirrored it, because authority is sometimes a trick of the neck. Jon had his sword out, and Daenerys turned and called, and the sound she made was not a word, but a name deeper than names. And the dragon came down. Nothing that big should be able to move with that speed. Nothing that heavy ought to stand on air the way a thought stands on the edge of a decision. Drogon hit the ground like a condoned thunderbolt. The wind of it shoved men 2 steps backward, whether they wanted to move or not. He opened his mouth and made of the air a story about heat that was not quite heat yet, and promise that was very nearly an oath. He did not speak the fire because fire was not what was required this second. Rhaegal landed beyond him, as if theater should remain symmetrical, if at all possible. The dead thing, no longer the man from the dice table, never anything again, kept coming. It did not look at the dragons because the dead do not understand hierarchy and cannot be insulted by spectacle. Jon went forward to meet it, because that was his nature, and Grey Worm's spear, thrown with the unshowy precision of a man who practices until error is unthinkable, past his shoulder, and found the thing's throat, and pinned it in place for the heartbeat it took Jon to make of that pause what he needed. The sword came down. The head separated. The sound, the steam of it. The morning rearranged itself around the fact of that ending. The bird hopped closer, not entirely satisfied. Men breathed out, in, out. Sewell leaned on his spear and found his hands were shaking, and his mouth was not. And he was proud of himself for what felt like the first time since his mother had looked at him and said, "You can carry that, can't you?" Daenerys reached out and put her hand on Drogon's side, and the heat went into her, in a way that felt exactly like mercy. Jon turned his head very slightly toward her, and he did not smile, and neither did she. And between those two decisions, there was a kind of agreement. Kings have spent wars trying to draft and have not achieved. Cersei stood in her solar with the window open because the cold did not come as far into the room as she had hoped, and she wanted it to. She held another letter, this one written by a more conventional hand, with more conventional fears crowding in at the edges of the lines. She read it and placed it beside the first. The city below her lived. The river went on with its work. The child inside her shifted as if it had rolled its shoulder. She felt the shape of the day change in a small way, like a carpet being laid from one end to the other, and then a moment when the weaver goes back to correct a mistake. She would send another 1,000 spears. She would send the rations faster. She would think of what to send later. For the first time in many mornings, she took the cup of wine to her mouth and tasted it, and tasted the spice, and also the metal. She put it down again and laughed softly because the sound felt like her. In the camp, Varys sat near the midline and spoke with a woman who had come to sell eggs and stories. He asked questions that were so ordinary as to be almost insulting. She answered because she liked the weight of his attention. He learned about a ford that had once been reliable, and now was not because the stones had gone out of it like teeth. He learned about a miller's son who had walked up the riverbank at night and never returned, and how his mother spoke as if she had found a better son under the bed. He learned about the way frost formed first on the willow leaves and then on the grass. When she had gone, he stared into the small fire and did not put his hands out to it, because his hands do not truly learn warmth. He thought of the North as if it were a person who had finally agreed to be known and would always retreat halfway through a sentence. Tyrion stood with Jon at the edge of the road, and they watched men carry wooden stakes as if they were very long, very patient animals that might decide to lie down in the middle of being carried. "I was once told," Tyrion said, "that if you set a table long enough and fill it with enough bread and meat and wine, the people who hate each other most in the room will eventually find themselves sitting side by side, eating from the same dish, and that at that point, war becomes less likely, not because they are friends, but because their elbows have learned the same manners." "Menebersal, we will need a very long table," Jon said. He did not look away from the men with the stakes. "We have a very long road," Tyrion said. "We will make do." The light went fast when it decided to go. Blue retreated. Shadows joined hands and became larger shadows. The fires rose. A singer somewhere tried out a song about a queen with hair the color of coin, and another with hair the color of snow. And the tune found itself under the singer's hands and became a thing worth carrying for a while. In the wind that found every gap in every tent flap and every seam in every cloak, there was the faintest suggestion of a smell not from the living world. It was not rot. It was not frost. It was the absence of those things' manners. It came and it went, and men did not say they smelled it, because to name it would be to make of it a guest. At midnight, the ravens went up from a stand of trees like arguments, and came down again at the call of the man who had raised them, since they were ugly and honest, and had not yet understood the sky. He wrote a message in a hand that had become slow and deliberate, because speed had never helped and accuracy always might. He tied it and sent it, and watched it go, and thought how strange it was that the world had chosen to trust its future to birds and women and men who did not much like their own voices. Cersei slept again and dreamed no dreams. Daenerys lay awake and listened to Drogon's breathing as one might listen to the sea inside a shell. Jon lay on his back and watched the canvas of the tent darken as something moved across the moon, and he did not try to decide what it had been because deciding would not alter its nature. Jaime woke to pissing and snoring and the small polite cough of a man trying not to wake the person next to him and failed. And he smiled because he remembered a barracks 30 years ago where the sounds had been the same and the world had been simpler only because he had been foolish. Brienne dreamed of a bridge and woke with the certainty that she should walk over it in the morning and check the ropes. Tyrion found, unexpectedly, that he had fallen asleep with his face in a book, and that the words had marked him and would not be fully rubbed out by morning. Missandei woke to a gentle, reasonable terror and whispered to it, and it left. Grey Worm, who did not remember his life before his name and did not wish to, sat up once and checked the angle of his spear against the wall and lay down again. And the dead, who were not men and women and had no uses for sleep, went on with their patient, implacable work beneath a sky that did not need to be told what it was to be sky. They moved through the trees and across the low ground, around the stones and over them, and the ice on their faces did not melt because heat did not concern itself with them. Somewhere, the Night King stood and did nothing, and that nothing was the precise center of all their somethings. The moonlight had no opinion but gave freely of itself to whatever lay in its path. The wind crossed the fields and went down into ditches, and lifted again into the hems of cloaks and the crowns of trees and the mouths of men. It carried with it the first few flakes, dry as ash, light as the breath of someone asleep. By morning, the flakes had gathered their courage and found their brothers and sisters and cousins and come to lay their hands on everything. The road was white, the tents frosted as if sugared, the hair of men touched. The dragons' backs wore a dusting that melted and returned and melted again. The great fine runnels of water cutting paths in the heat-dusted scales. The steam rising and becoming cloud a second time. The world was quiet in the way of places where excitement has been tidied away for later. Men rose and shook themselves and accused one another of stealing blankets in their sleep. A horse farted in a manner that made 3 men laugh so hard one of them had to sit down. Someone dropped a pot and swore in a language no one near him understood, and thus did not show offense. Sansa in Winterfell smiled when she saw the first proper snow of the year, because it felt like a thing she possessed and could distribute according to merit. And in a way she could. She set men to sweeping, and boys to hauling, and women to counting, and all of it was power. Daenerys went out and stood with Drogon while he ate a side of beef the size of a small horse, and made of it a series of delicate gestures with a mouth that could end a city. She touched him and felt the gratitude that is the cousin of all. Jon came to her side and said nothing of consequence, and everything of consequence by nothing at all. Nearby, men loaded stakes onto sledges because even in the wet, the ground had gone hard, and would take them better that way than on wheels. Grey Worm explained this to a man from the Riverlands, with the patience of a person who understands that patience is not a luxury, but a structural necessity. The man nodded, grateful, and then went to explain it, badly, to another man, who nevertheless understood. Tyrion stood with Varys and counted, and wrote and counted again, and looked up now and then to see how tall the day had grown. Cersei, high in her city, put on a heavy gown she did not like, and went out into the gardens, and stood where once she had stood in silk with wine and a smile, and had watched the world burn in her favor. Snow fell there. It came rare and serious, not the kind that blunders into your eyelashes and runs away, but the kind that means to stay. She turned her face up a fraction and let 2 flakes melt on her cheek. She did not think of children. She thought of stone and grain and fire, and the precise number of men who would need to die for her to say to herself, "I have extracted the full value from this bargain." The ravens came and went. The fires burned. The road stretched ahead and behind in equal measure. The cold laid a hand on the world and pressed down very gently, as if testing how much it could afford to take without breaking what it meant to keep. In the north, the trees sang with ice. In the south, the fountains slowed their speech a little, but did not yet cease. Between those 2 statements lay an army, and in the center of that army stood 2 women who had said yes to one another, because to do otherwise would have been to say no to breath. On the third day of snow, a boy from the Stormlands who had never seen real winter laughed until his stomach hurt, and then cried without sound for his mother, and for the taste of oranges, and for the fact that he couldn't remember his best friend's voice anymore. He wiped his face with the back of his hand and went to help a man tighten a strap, because the strap needed tightening more than his grief needed airing. Bronn stole a sausage in front of its owner and said something so obscene and so precisely true about hunger that the man choked on his laughter. Brienne caught a man staring at her and stared back until he remembered he had a job. Jaime loosened his gorget slightly because the cold had made the metal bite along his collarbone. He did not shiver. Missandei found a child under a wagon who had fallen asleep while playing with a carved dragon and carried her back to the cookfire, where the child woke and blinked and held out the dragon with the sovereign generosity of the very young. Grey Worm watched the exchange and felt something he did not quite have a name for, but that did not make him uncomfortable. At dusk, the sky went slate, and then indigo, and then the particular thin black of nights where the cold eats the colors left behind by the day. Lights pricked out along the road. The dragons went up once, twice, and then settled with patient inevitability. The dead moved closer with their same patience. Between the two, a space remained. It held the living. In that space, Daenerys and Cersei met again. Not in a ring of stone, but in a long, cold tent that had been made warmer by the presence of too many people and the insistence of their breath. They faced one another across a table with a map on it. The map said the world was untroubled by the concept of human preference and had lain like this for longer than courts could remember. Tyrion stood at Daenerys' shoulder like a thought she had thought, and might think again. Qyburn stood at Cersei's like a certainty that would not decline to be proven uncertain if proof could be made useful. Jon was there because he was always there when the world required something like a moral center, but he kept his eyes on the inked rivers and did not claim role in any play. We can hold at the neck if we are willing to let the river take the bodies, Daenerys said. The cold will do much of that work for us. The dragon glass will do the rest. The river will bring them back to us when it thaws, Cersei said. I will not fight this war twice. Then we burn them, Jon said, calm. We burn them on the banks, which means we must keep firewood piled and ready and dry. We must organize that transport. We must allocate men to the fires as if they are the left wing of an army. Then, Cersei considered him as one considers a craftsman who, having been hired to make a chair, has made a chair that also is a poem. You have become quite useful, she said. There was a compliment in it. She did not attempt to remove it. Fine. Fires. The city will send wagons. Many. They argued the small arguments. How many men could stand an hour in that wind before hands forgot the idea of grip? Whether the Unsullied should hold the center and let men who did not break be the hinge, or whether they should be the hinge and let other men learn the strength of their own companionship. Whether the dragons should be used to scout in daylight or conserved as surprises. They did not argue the larger thing, because it was not yet time. When at last they were done, not because they had finished, but because the hour required it, they stood. Cersei's lips made the smallest white line. Daenerys' hand was steady on the table's edge. I enjoyed being the only queen in the room, Cersei said, as if she had not noticed until now that enjoyment had been present. I enjoyed being the only woman at my war councils, Daenerys said. It made men's ideas easier to count. Tiresome to be singular, Cersei said. Tiresome, Daenerys said, and smiled with the corner of her mouth, not unkindly. The night breathed. The snow went on with its patient work of finding every surface on which to lay a hand. Far beyond the line of their sight, the Night King turned his head the way a man does when he hears a distant sound he does not yet recognize. He did not smile. The cold he wore as a garment lay very close, and the garment improved the shape of him as well as protected him from every conceivable heat. He lifted one hand and then did not do anything with it, and the world read this as eloquence. Around him the dead shifted because the living had been shifting, and the dead remembered motion as a response to motion and could make a habit of it. Along the road, the fires burned steady and small and courteous. Men warmed their hands and put them away again. Somewhere, a man played a bone flute. Somewhere else, two boys discovered that if they spoke into a hole in the ground at the same time, the sound that came back up was hilarious and might mean something if you were the kind of person to find meaning in that kind of thing. A woman sewed a patch on a man's sleeve, while the man tried to teach her a curse in Dornish that required a gesture too obscene to be demonstrated, and therefore was translated very badly. The dragons slept, and their sleep made the air warmer for a time. Jon looked up at the sky and tried to remember the names of every star, and got them wrong, and did not mind. Tyrion read a page he had read before, and found in it a sentence that had not been present, or that he had never been present to read. Brienne walked the rope bridge all the way across and back, and then slept as if someone had explained resting to her, and she had agreed. Grey Worm sharpened his spear for the 7th time, and then stopped, because discipline is as much about not doing as doing. Missandei braided a girl's hair, and then unbraided it, because the girl had decided she preferred it the way it had been. And Missandei preferred the girl's certainty to her own accomplishment. In the Red Keep, Cersei dismissed everyone from her presence, and opened a chest that had once held gifts for a wedding that had never happened because the bride had died, and found inside it a length of cloth she had never liked when it had been new. She let it fall open and ran her fingers along the fine edge. She thought of her father as if he were a tool she could take out and use for a particular job. She thought of her son as if he were a prayer that had been answered incorrectly, but had nevertheless satisfied a rule. She thought of Daenerys as if she were a mirror. She felt the child's motion again and thought, "You will inherit a winter that has learned the shape of our hands." At the edge of the freezing marsh, Sewell the pikeman watched the frost creep along the ground, as if it were a very small army rehearsing. He tightened his cloak and squinted, and thought he saw movement where there could not be movement, and then decided there was none, and then the shape resolved itself into a fox, who stared at him with the entitlement of fresh hunger before slipping away into the reed beds. Sewell laughed out loud and surprised himself with the sound, which was like his father's, and therefore like being forgiven. Dawn came late the next day, and arrived with the sound of wood complaining about its duties and men deciding not to complain. The sky was the color of old milk. The air tasted like coin. The road was a patient thing, bearing patient weight. And at the far edge of every sight, like a flaw in glass, something blew. Snow fell, and fell, and fell. The fires burned. The letters flew. The dragons breathed. The men and women ate and cursed and slept and woke, and did the work. The dead moved. Between them, a space remained. And in that space, an alliance held against the pressure of everything that had taught the world to disbelieve in such things. It held because there was no other thing to do but hold. It held with the delicate, muscular persistence of breath.